Let's now talk to journalist and broadcaster Neil Clark. Neil, very nice to have you with us this hour. What's your assessment of who's behind the worst of this violence? Does it seem heavily orchestrated to you?
Hello there. Well, it does actually. And I thought, remember the old saying, you reap what you sow, and the US is really reaping what it sowed. Let's think back to February 2011. The US took part with NATO in the attack on Gaddafi's Libya, bringing death and destruction. And they've created this sort of violent situation. So while, of course, we condemn the terrible attacks on the US consulate, the murder of Chris Stevens, and, of course, the people responsible are those who carried out the killings, we've got to put this in its wider context. And this wouldn't have happened had NATO not intervened last year.
Is there a sense that the government's losing its grip on an angry public in Egypt, which has been at boiling point ever since the uprising? Well,
I think the government's losing its grip in Libya, in Egypt, and across the region. And the US is the party that's been stoking all this up. The US has been aggressively supporting uprisings across the region for its own interests. And now it's a kind of blowback time. The US is getting it back. And, I think non-interference is the best way to go, really.
Right. It's been reported that President Obama might deploy drones to seek out the mob who killed their ambassador to Libya. So if it's true, what do you make of such a move?
Well, what are they going to do? Regime change again? I mean, we had this last year. I mean, Gaddafi was a dictator, but it was a stable country. The US and NATO decided to intervene. And in fact, if we look across the globe, everywhere where NATO has intervened has been a disaster. We look at Iraq, 1 million people killed there. Yugoslavia, in Kosovo, we've had the ethnic cleansing of Serbs and Roma. Somalia, chaos there. Afghanistan, 11 years of war. And yet we still get the same old people calling for intervention across the globe. When will they learn that it just leads to more death and destruction?
And as you say, the US has invested time, money and extraordinary effort to what it sees as liberating these countries, yet it's all coming undone in a flash. So can America recover its efforts from this?
America's got to pull back, basically, and change its course. I mean, they've intervened in Libya. It's been disastrous. Western multinationals are taking over the economy, of course, as I say, in Egypt. But ordinary people pay the price. And I think we've got to change our course completely now after this.
So what lessons are there for America's foreign policy here by going into these countries with the intention of being a liberator, but which become controlled either by radical groups or uncontrollable angry mobs?
Well, it's happening in Syria too, where we've had intervention. And of course, Syria was a country relatively peaceful 18 months ago. The US intervened there with its allies to back the opposition there. Peaceful protests were turned into violent ones because of the US line. And so we need to really change this whole policy and to leave other countries alone, let them sort out their own affairs. But the neocons are still, I'm afraid, very, very powerful in Washington. And they're the people pushing this agenda of regime change, regime change in Libya, regime change in Iraq, regime change in Syria. And so long as these neocons have influence, all we're going to get is more death and destruction, I'm afraid.
Let's talk about Egypt again. So could this anti-American anger there be enough to undermine Egypt's fragile new democracy?
Well, I think people in Egypt are very upset at what's happened. They thought there was going to be a real change when Mubarak went, but things have stayed the same. Morsi has been a big flop, really. The people are very poor. People are unhappy with the way things have gone. And so I think unless there's real change in Egypt, this will only continue, I'm afraid.
All right, Neil Clark, journalist and broadcaster, thank you very much indeed.